Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the SciComm Spectrum podcast. Today I'm sitting down with Ashley Tyrer, a cognitive neuroscientist studying how we make decisions under uncertainty. What I'm really excited to get into is the work Ashley does beyond her research. She is deeply involved in the world of science communication and is clearly very passionate about it. She leads the blog team for the Organization for Human Brain Mapping's Communication Committee, overseeing initiatives such as Brain Bites, short features that distill cutting-edge research into layman's terms, and the Neuroscientist podcast, which features conversations between leading neuroscientists in the field. In this conversation, explore how Ashley got into science communication, the power of relatability in scientific storytelling, and why building trust between scientists and the public is now more vital than ever. Let's get into it. Ashley, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. It's great to see you. Whereabouts are you based right now?
I'm based in Aarhus in Denmark, which is it's the second largest city in Denmark, but it's actually very small. It's really nice. So I came here for my postdoc in 2021 after I finished my PhD in the University of Bristol in the UK.
Awesome. And what were you studying? What is your background in for someone who has never encountered you before?
So I did my bachelor's at the University of Edinburgh in just classic biomedical sciences in neuroscience. So that was a lot of molecular neuroscience. And then my dissertation project was actually in neurogenetics. So I worked a lot on genome editing techniques. And then when I moved to Bristol for my PhD, I was on a PhD program that involves some rotations. So we had the opportunity to try a lot of different research techniques and backgrounds and things, which I found really, really useful because, to be honest, I didn't really know what I wanted to do. So that opportunity to sort of dip my toe in many different ponds, if you will, was really great. And one of those was a computational neuroscience rotation. And I'd never coded before in my life, but my who eventually became my PhD supervisor really took me on a journey of coding and computational modeling, and I just absolutely fell in love with it. So I pursued that for the remainder of my PhD, and then I've taken that with me as well as part of my postdoc. So I'm mainly computational and cognitive neuroscience is what I do now.
What is it that you do as a postdoc in Aarhus, Denmark?
I mainly focus on decision making. So if I may, I'll kind of take you on a kind of thought experiment. Essentially, imagine if you have a bag of sweets, and in that bag of sweets are many different coloured sweets that are individually wrapped, and each wrapper has a different colour. Can you picture the bag of sweets?
Yeah, I'm focusing.
So the colour of the wrappers or the colour of the sweets gives an indication of what flavour that sweet is.
Mm-hmm.
So you pick out a sweet that has a red wrapper and you think, okay, based on my previous experience of the sweets, the red wrapper is probably going to be strawberry flavoured. And you like strawberries, they're really sweet, they're really kind of tarty, you like it, like, okay, great. I have some kind of positive expectations about how this sweet is going to taste because of the wrapper, and you've kind of used that information to make these predictions basically about how that is going to taste. So then you take sweet out of the wrapper and you eat it and you go, oh, it's cinnamon. No. And you experience this kind of unexpected sensation, basically, because you're expecting it to taste like a strawberry when actually it tastes like cinnamon that you might not necessarily be a fan of, right? And what we call that experience is a prediction error, because you've made that prediction about what you're going to experience in your environment, and then what you actually experience is completely different. So we had kind of what we call our model of the world, in which there is this state of the world where sweets with red wrappers can taste like strawberries because that's what you've experienced in the past. And then you've acquired this new information, this kind of new sensory intake, basically, that a red wrappered sweet can also taste of cinnamon. And then we use that information to update our sort of model of the world to say, okay, based on this new sensory information, sweets that are in a red wrapper can either taste of strawberry or cinnamon. And I'm going to use that information going forward for the rest of the bag of sweets to be like, okay, this might not necessarily be strawberries anymore, it might be cinnamon. So the work that I focus on is kind of using this information about how we experience uncertainty in our environment, because obviously there's kind of two possible past selves. We have a past self where we've eaten lots of bags of sweets in the past, and our beliefs that we have about those flavors of sweets is really, really strong because we have a lot of evidence from the past. And then another possible experience is that this is your first ever bag of sweets. So these colours don't have a lot of meaning. because you haven't experienced that in the past so much. So yeah, my research kind of focuses on how we process these surprises and this uncertainty in our everyday lives, and how we process that and how we make these decisions about what to do next once we've experienced this surprise or prediction error, basically.
How does that apply to everyday life, or where does this work have impact?
Yeah. So my kind of focus in this domain is how certain chemicals in the brain might affect this process. And for example, in conditions like ADHD, in depression, in anxiety, this process might be disturbed in some way, like the way that people make decisions might be different from, say, somebody who's neurotypical, somebody who has a different mental health condition. It can even go into neurodegeneration and dementia. And I'm interested in a chemical in the brain called noradrenaline, and how different kind of levels and activities related to noradrenaline in the brain might affect this decision-making process. So at the moment, I just look at kind of healthy neurotypical individuals. So the decision-making process is very individualized. You can get two individuals who are kind of categorized as young, healthy, kind of same demographic, both neurotypicals. Their individualized decision-making process is not necessarily going to be the same, because they're different people, they have different lives, they have a lot of different prior experiences, and they're going to use that prior experience in a completely different way to make those decisions, right? So I'm interested in looking at not necessarily just the young, healthy population, but not considering participants as like the control group and the condition group or the focus group or whatever. Because the way that people make decisions is very much of a spectrum. So if we're able to detect sort of individual differences in the way that we make decisions, it might tell us a lot more about what's going wrong in people with ADHD, people with depression, people with anxiety. And then that might give us some tools to actually help those people and improve everyday life, basically.
That's really interesting that you approach the studies without this sort of traditional, let's say, scientific setup of control and then variable, or control and non-control group, like independent variable you're testing. How does that work if you're treating everybody as an individual with their own decision-making process? How can you then determine what you're benchmarking these groups that you've mentioned, like people with ADHD or depression or anxiety or whatever other groups there might be? How can you decide what the difference is that you need to correct for or help if you don't have a benchmark to put it against? How does that work?
Yeah, it's a really, really tricky problem, basically. So what happens in a lot of our data collections that we will use these kind of standard DSM-5 kind of self-report surveys that are often used in the clinic to diagnose people with various mental health conditions, just to get a metric of where everybody scores on that scale, essentially. Now, that kind of opens a whole other can of worms, because the DSM-5 has a lot of problems with it. The main problem being that, when you go into the GP and you say, I've been experiencing very dark thoughts, I think I'm depressed, and then they give you this kind of questionnaire to complete, the way the questionnaires in the DSM-5 have been constructed is assuming that there are no co-coincidences of multiple mental health conditions. So one of my colleagues is she's running a study actually looking at pain, to be honest, and how people experience chronic pain, but is including these DSM-5 questionnaires as a part of the process, just to get kind of some demographic information about all of the people she's including in the study. And the kind of benchmark that she had was that she wanted at least 50 individuals in each of the different categories of depression, anxiety, OCD, bipolar disorder, and a few others. And I think there were, out of over 500 people that she looked at, only about 25 only had one of those conditions. Like, everybody else had multiple mental health conditions simultaneously. So that is one of the big problems, in that kind of the way that it's classically diagnosed is that you kind of go in assuming that somebody only got one of these conditions that were defined a long, long time ago as well, and haven't really been updated in the way that they should have been. So this is kind of why I like computational modeling, because it allows us to estimate parameters that describe people's behavior and people's kind of the way that they make these choices and make these decisions in a very individualistic way. So it produces our model parameters that might describe how impulsive is somebody's behavior, how sort of rigid we call it, if somebody's sticking with one decision and just kind of, smashing the living daylights out of this one decision because they don't want to deviate from what they've originally chosen, right? So we have this set of parameters that describe the behavior of one person. So we can look at how that correlates with these scores and how it correlates with other things and creates this spectrum of behavior. But at the heart of it, I think, there is an inherent problem with diagnosis and classification of these conditions from the get-go. So we're doing what we can with what we have, but it does speak to a systemic problem about diagnosis itself. So it's a really hard problem to solve.
And so when you're saying behaviors correlating with different things, it makes me think of where my mind went was just like being able to correlate maybe the emergence of certain mental health disorders with past life events. Is that something that this could be applied to?
Potentially. There's a lot of different components that contribute to these things. So a big one is genetics, but it's not in the simple kind of form where it's like, oh, there's this one gene. And when this one gene is mutated in this way, then we get ADHD. Unfortunately, that would be very easy for scientists if that's how it works. But unfortunately, it's more of a polygenic relationship. So there may be a vast number of genes that kind of, when mutated in certain ways, all collectively contribute to one kind of expressed behavior, essentially. So that can be part of it. There can be past experiences that can be part of it. The combination of genetics and past experiences can interact with each other. Somebody might express a set of genes that may, have been reported to contribute to one condition, but that individual might not express that condition because of something that has or hasn't happened to them. And it's super, super complex.
And what about just playing this forward, thinking about it? I just really want to get to the applications of this. The other place my mind went was military and doing almost the reverse, not decoding how past things affect your behavior now, but what can we do to you to manipulate how you will make decisions as a soldier having faster reflexes, or I don't know, making less emotional decisions in the field, or you know what I mean? I'm not a military expert by any means, but this is just where my mind went from watching too much Black Mirror, obviously.
Yeah, that's a very, very interesting question. I think it could also speak to the selection process. Let's say hypothetically that we reach some discovery where we can apply these things and enhance certain traits in individuals. I imagine that you're also going to have this kind of individual differences in how susceptible people are to those things. So then that brings into question, would that be part of the sort of military selection process, Because at the moment there is a selection process where there's kind of IQ tests, there's, physical training, all sorts of different things. Would it, also become part of it that, susceptibility to manipulation is also going to be part of it? So yeah, one of my colleagues previously worked on hypnosis. She was looking at susceptibility to hypnosis, and she had to screen her volunteers, her participants, to test if they were susceptible enough to hypnosis to actually participate in the experiment. And because it was an imaging study, she was using the MRI scanner in the hospital. It's very costly to book that time in the MRI scanner and then find out that, actually my participant is not susceptible to hypnosis. So she had to sit in a room with her participants and try to hypnotize them. So she underwent training on how to, induce hypnosis. And then there was this selection process where she would try to hypnotize somebody and then find out whether if they were susceptible or not. And then if they were susceptible and were able to be hypnotized, they then went on to participate in the study. So it could be something like that, because I think one of the big challenges of computational neuroscience, medicine, computational psychiatry is kind of individual differences and individualized medicine. Because I think there's a lot of conditions where a generalized approach works, which is great. It costs the healthcare system a lot less if there's kind of a one-shot solution that works for everybody. But we've found out, particularly for mental health conditions, that is not the case and doesn't always work. So I think this individualized approach and kind of detecting those differences in the way people behave is really, really important.
Something else I wanted to ask you about is your work with the Organization for Human Brain Mapping Communications Committee. It's a mouthful. OHBM for short. So can you tell me a little bit about who they are and what they do and what you do with them?
Yes, of course. So the Organization for Human Brain Mapping, or OHBM, is a conference that happens every summer, every year, and it rotates continent. So last year it was just in Brisbane. The year before, in 2024, it was in Seoul in Korea, which I actually did get the opportunity to go there. It was absolutely amazing. But it's a conference, and it's a very large conference, and it essentially covers all aspect of human brain mapping. It's just what it says on the tin. So any research that either advances on methods for mapping the human brain, or any research that has contributed to uncovering the way that the human brain works in terms of structure or function, or kind of correlations between behavior or, kind of phenotypic traits, essentially. And OHBM Communications Committee, or for short, OHBM ComCom. So I'm in charge of the blog team. I've just taken over for this year. We try and kind of spread the information about what OHBM is doing and what we talk about at these events every year. And we try to communicate that to the general public in a way that is digestible, kind of user-friendly, because I think a lot of things one of the key things that deters people from learning about science is that there's so many articles and pieces of work that are sort of written by experts for experts. And it kind of feels a bit gatekeepy, and it does deter a lot of people from learning about these things. So what we're trying to do with the blog, and also with the Neuroscientist podcast and with Brain Bites, is try and break down some of the topics that the conference covers in a much more kind of, general public friendly way.
And what inspired you to get involved with that? Because I'm sure you're very busy with your actual postdoc research work.
Yes.
And this definitely takes up time, running a blog and, being involved in any kind of communications effort. So what inspired you to do that?
Well, OHBM is definitely one of my favorite conferences. I first went in 2018, and that was in Singapore. And it was also, I think it was the first international conference that I ever went to. And I was like, wow, I absolutely love seeing what everybody's doing and hearing about what everybody's doing. But there's so many people. I think at that conference, there were 5,000 attendees. It was as like, a new PhD student. It was so overwhelming. But I wanted to speak to all of these really eminent scientists and kind of just get to know how they got to that point. They've discovered something really, really impactful, but what led them to that? What decisions did they make to get to that point? Who helped them, the chain of communication that they've undergone to reach that point in their career as well. So then fast forward to 2024, this had kind of been ticking away in my mind, wanting to know a lot more about all of these really, really cool people who do the science. And then I went to OHBM in Korea, and I bumped into a friend that I knew from my PhD days. We were just kind of walking around the conference, and I was like, oh, hello, fancy seeing you here on the other side of the world. And he said that he was the chair of the OHBM ComCom, and we should go for coffee, talk about more about what they do. And then he was telling me about basically how we interview these scientists who have given these phenomenal keynote lectures and interviewing people who have kind of won these awards, but then also about what Brain Bites does, which is essentially writes a lay summary or a lay article about a really impactful piece of work that has recently come out. And not only is it really, really great to communicate that information in a digestible way for the general public, but it also gives us an opportunity to contact those scientists directly and say, we think your work is really cool and we want to talk about it and, get to know each other and make that connection. So it was really fortuitous in a way that I got involved, because I just happened to bump into my friend at one of these events. So I'm really, really lucky, and I'm really grateful that happened. Because now I'm involved in this. Because, for example, something that I really wanted to do during my PhD was get involved in Pints of Science, which is a global festival for communicating science in your local bar or your local pub or public space. But I really I regret not getting involved because as a PhD student, I was like, oh, I haven't got time for any of those things. I have to focus on my PhD and I have to get the work done and I have to be really studious. But I never did it. And I left. I was like, oh, I really wish I would have done that, because for me personally, communicating science to people that are just not in your immediate circle, it really helps to keep me grounded. Like when you're going to the lab every day and just working on your things, it's very, very easy to just get lost in the weeds of what you're doing and thinking about the technicalities. Like, I have this immediate problem that I need to solve. How am I going to write this script to do this analysis? How am I going to, make this figure? How am I going to make this bar plot and all this sort of stuff? And when you're very busy, and obviously PhD days are super, super busy, and then you get to postdoc and like, now it's really busy, and it scales up. And then it becomes really easy to lose sight of what you're actually doing. So then the opportunity to step back and not only talk about what you're doing and the bigger picture of what you're doing and what that really means to the general public and to society, but also talk to other people about what their work means to society and to the bigger picture as well. And then sharing those ideas and learning about what other people are doing that is very different to what you're doing. And it kind of helps to contextualize what you do as well. And it's this interaction from these different fields, because even though OHBM is a neuroscience conference and it's a neuroscience community, there's still so much variation in everything that we do. And we can really learn so much from each other. And it's a fabulous opportunity to really do that.
I think it's really interesting that you talk about how science communication helps you and helps other scientists, and why it's important to keep you sort of grounded, motivated, and driven by what you do. Because, yeah, it's true that you can lose sight of the why very quickly when you get into the day in, day out and the little frustrations and the things that keep adding up and all of that. I'm curious, why do you think science communication is important for the general public? Why is it important for a layperson to be able to access information on what is going on at the forefront of some of these fields? Thank you so much for tuning into the first half of my conversation with Ashley. Before we go any further, I have a quick request to make. If you've been enjoying the conversation so far, please take a moment and support the show for free. First, leave a 5-star review wherever you're listening. If you're on YouTube, leave a comment of what you've learned so far. Secondly, please subscribe, like, and hit the notification bell. It really helps this podcast reach more people. And third of all, please share this with somebody you think would enjoy the conversation, because these stories matter most when they reach the people who need to hear them. Okay, that's all from me. Let's get back to Ashley.
Yeah. I think it's particularly important in like nowadays in the current climate that people can build trust between themselves and scientists and healthcare professionals and things. Because for many, many years, it's very much been the case where it's been this kind of old, rich, white man who's like the classic scientist, the classic doctor that's kind of, not necessarily preaching information, but declaring information is like, well, I must be believed because I am the expert in blah, blah, blah. And we've seen, particularly in the States, unfortunately, a lot of people are kind of, not necessarily trusting experts anymore. We saw a lot, particularly during COVID-19, where people didn't necessarily trust the vaccine and were protesting against the vaccine, against science and that sort of thing. And I think rather than doubling down and saying, well, you should just trust us anyway because we have the degrees and we have the experience and you should just listen because you're just the general public. That's not going to work. We need to build this culture of trust between the scientists and the general public. It's like, well, actually, everybody can understand what we're doing. We just need to make it more accessible in a sense. So I think it's really important to build this level of trust and also show that I think the general public sometimes has this sort of cookie cutter idea of what a scientist is. So I come from a very working class background. I grew up in the northwest of England in a place called St. Helens, which I hold very close to my heart because it is my hometown. But that becoming a scientist wasn't really the prospect of people from a place like that, essentially. So, when I'm kind of going about my day and I'm getting in a very casual conversation with somebody to say, oh, what do you do? And I say, well, I'm a scientist. And they kind of think, oh, a young woman is a scientist. Like, oh, okay, this is, wasn't expecting that. So creating this communication can also show people, well, anybody can be a scientist. I think this also speaks to the importance of diversity in the scientific community, because it shows us that, anybody can become a scientist if if they want to, and if they put their minds to it. And then also, scientists should be relatable, because, it shows people that they can do that as well. But then this relatability also speaks to the fact that it's easier to build trust with somebody that you can relate to as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And one of the things there that came to my mind was this idea of citizen scientists, like amateur. I know, for example, in astronomy, there's a lot of this. Like, I write for an astronomy YouTube channel, and I'm sometimes in these forums, and there's a lot of astronomers who are just amateur, passionate people with telescopes who will do things like track certain stars or celestial bodies. And then there's entire forums where they collate information. I don't remember which. I literally was reading about this recently. I don't know if it was a comet. I think it must have been a comet. It was some kind of sighting that no one really knows what it was or why it happened, when it happened, and it was all just very surprising. And the information that came out primarily was sort of this brainchild of all these amateur astronomers all around the world sharing information like in real time. Oh, I saw this and I saw that and I saw that. And then the official scientific bodies, planetary astronomical bodies, institutions, were leaning on that information to base their initial like observations and studies. And I just thought it was so interesting. So when you're saying anyone can be a scientist, like it's really true. I know this is also very big in, I think, ecology, when it comes to things with like mapping or counting populations. Or just here last week, I was on the Great Ocean Road in Australia, and there was all these signposts everywhere of different species that were endangered. And there was one bird in particular, I don't remember what it was called. And there were posters everywhere of it saying, it's the nesting season now, so please be careful. Please, like, don't make too much noise, this, that. You could disturb the nests, and the population is really low, so we need them to hatch properly and like not get the parents to get scared away, because then the eggs will get eaten by the predators. And then there was a number that said, if you sight this bird, call this number and like report it so we can like log it. And I think that's a beautiful example of the public being asked to be involved in science. And that doesn't feel like a stuffy academic ivory tower in a lab coat and a Frankenstein rising up while lightning strikes. Like, that's a very normal everyday thing that you might not think twice about, but that's you participating in science.
Well, that's a really, really fabulous initiative, because it also creates a sense of community between people. It's like, we're all working together to, discover information and contribute to, our information about the world that we live in. I mean, we all have to live here, so if we learn more about it collectively, it's never going to be a bad thing.
So coming back to the OHBM ComCom that we were talking about, you said that you're managing the blog this year for 2025. How do you decide what to feature?
So basically, like I said before, OHBM stands for Organization for Human Brain Mapping. That's a very big umbrella. There's a whole lot of research that can come under the umbrella of human brain mapping. So we really have to think about what most, if not all, people in that community is really going to be interested in. So the main things that we kind of focus on is, like I said earlier, we do the blog posts for our keynote series and our award winners. So that's kind of like the main sets of blogs that we write. But also, mainly we do a lot of posts about studies on mental health, because that's something that no matter who you are in the world, that is something that's going to impact your life, whether you suffer from mental health issues yourself, or if you have a close friend or relative that suffers from mental health conditions. And that's something that really affects our day-to-day lives, everybody. So that's really at the forefront of a lot of the posts that we write, and also methods as well, because even if people come from very different kind of research backgrounds, any significant advances in methods development is going to be really interesting, because it's a case of, we've discovered this thing where we can, image the brain at a significantly higher resolution that's going to contribute to everybody's research, because now we can do things differently. So that's a big one as well. And then also, if there's a really, really impactful paper that's come out in, let's say, Nature or Science or Brain, for example, many of those really, really high impact journals, then we might focus on them as well. And that kind of speaks to what Brain Bites also covers. So if there's a really eminent paper that's come out that, for example, I think psychedelics and psychedelic research is really topical at the moment, because use of psychedelics is it's been a taboo subject for a very, very long time. And I think the use of psychedelics has a lot of potential that we're only just really starting to tap into, because that taboo is kind of very slowly but surely being removed. And so that's something that's really topical at the moment that we do focus on in a lot of our posts, and because it has a lot of potential and there's a lot of things that we don't know about it.
What is Brain Bites? Just in case people might not know what that is.
Sorry, yes, it's our lay media section of OHBM ComCom, where they're kind of just short pieces that cover kind of select research that has come out recently, and we explain kind of the key concept and the main findings in a kind of, plain English digestible way.
And so how is the kind of content that ends up on Brain Bites different from what ends up on the blog?
With the blog, I think we have a bit more space to get a bit more technical. So with Brain Bites, it's more of a summary of a piece of research that has just come out, and it's kind of very concise and very to the point, but also plain English, like I said. Whereas with the blog, more often than not, it's a kind of conversation with another researcher. With the blog, we can get into a few more specificities about what they're working on. But then, because the blog is more kind of a longer form piece, if there's any technicalities, we have the space to explain those technicalities. With Brain Bites and with the podcast in particular, overuse of jargon is not particularly beneficial. Whereas with the blog, obviously overuse of jargon is not great, but we can use a bit because we have the space to explain what it means as well. So the blog just gives a little bit more flexibility, because I think across the 3 different platforms, it's super, super important to just know your audience. And so for the podcast, people might be listening on their way to work. So technical terminologies and getting into the weeds of certain pieces of research, we're going to lose people. So the podcast is very much kind of a conversation between 2 scientists and throwing ideas back and forth. And that's something that you can stay engaged with while you're like listening to the podcast, while you're at the gym, or while you're on your way to work, or while you're doing this, that, and the other. Whereas the blog is kind of, the audience is slightly different, because it's less of a kind of equal conversation, more of an interview sort of process. Still conversational, but like I said, you do have more space to get into some more details, essentially. And then for Brain Bites, it is very much kind of, it's punchy. This is what it means. This is a really cool piece of work. This is a way that we can explain it to everybody in a way that everybody's going to understand.
Nice. That makes perfect sense. And I want to come back to the podcast in a second, but first I want to understand your day-to-day on the blog. Are you managing a team of writers and you're just kind of like deciding, kind of more like an editor-in-chief kind of role? Or are you yourself also drafting pieces?
Yeah, so kind of both. So we have a few writers. So we're all scientists who are volunteering to be part of ComCom. So, we're all doing our own things, kind of doing our day job, and then we come and do this in our spare time. So super, super grateful for everybody that gets involved, because they are taking, time out of their day and time out of their working time to contribute to the blog, which, they're all amazing and they do such a great job. And I'm super grateful for all of them. But there's also not that many of us. So I also I wear 2 hats, basically. I kind of wear the managerial hat, where it's communicating with our volunteers, say, we have this interview that we need to write up as a blog. We have this person who we want to interview, who we should contact and see if they're willing to either do a classic traditional format of a blog in a written form, or if they're happy to do a video interview. Then there will also be interviews that I will take, and then I will reach out to that scientist and I'll say, we want to do this interview with you. And then I will also come up with the questions and then, interact with that person on that level. So it is a mix. And, sometimes, even though I'm the blog team lead, I might do some of the social media stuff. I might do some of the lay media posting, and I might do some other things. Because in ComCom, like I said, we are all volunteers. Even Johan, who is the chair of the whole committee, he's got his own stuff to be doing as well. But he's doing a fabulous job. And I don't know how he does it, because being the manager and being the chair of the entire committee, it's a lot of work. But yeah, we're doing what we can.
It's awesome that there's a team of like ragtag neuroscientists that are just so passionate about what they do that they want to spend their extra free time making sure that other people know about it. And I think that just speaks to the amount of drive and passion you all must have for what you do, and also the belief in the importance of this getting to a wider audience. So that's really cool.
Absolutely.
Have you ever run into any sort of challenges with your interviews where your subject is maybe very jargon heavy in their language and then you have to pare that back when you come to draft? Or what, I guess what I'm getting at is, how does your brain shift from writing sort of very academic type of work to writing for this blog? Because I imagine it's two completely different skill sets almost.
Definitely, yeah. As a postdoc in particular, even if we put ComCom to the side for a second, just as a postdoc, you have to wear so many hats. So in our day-to-day research and our day-to-day work, it does get very technical and it does get very jargon heavy. And then when you're writing the papers, and depending on which journal you want to send it to, so let's say that I've done some kind of very technical computational modeling and I want to submit that to Nature Communications, for example, right? That's quite a wide-reaching journal in terms of the subject matter. So then I have to adapt my language in my own paper to make sure that not only the readers of that journal, but also the reviewers and the editors of that journal, who might not necessarily work in the field that I work in, can really fully understand the work that I've done. Because editors and reviewers, they are editing and reviewing so many papers, and they do not have the time to be Googling words that I've used. If they have to do that, reject, gone. Because they haven't got time. And then to take an even more extreme example, as a postdoc, you have to be writing grants a lot. Because at the end of the day, scientists need money. We need money to fund the research. So we also have to spend some time writing grants. And grants are even more restrictive because generally the competition for grants is extremely high. When writing grants, it's super, super important to not only really clearly explain your research ideas and exactly what you want to do, but also explain in very concise terms why it's important. So, for example, I applied for a grant last year and I had 5 pages to explain the background of what I wanted to do, the technicalities of what I wanted to do, my hypotheses, what I expected to find and why it was important, with 2 figures as well, all in 5 pages, which is super, super hard. So you really have to be very critical of what you write and the language that you use. And, you really have to stress the importance and the impact of all of the work that you want to be doing. So these are some skills that you kind of use in your everyday life as a postdoc, and you can transfer that to OHBM ComCom, and you can kind of put on the grant writing hat or the user-friendly language hat, for example. So also when people publish papers, a really common thing to do nowadays is write a Twitter thread or a social media post and kind of increase engagement in the papers that you've written. And particularly if you pre-printed your manuscript before submitting to a journal, it really increases the engagement with your preprint as well by writing a social media post. And the best way to get the engagement with that post is to assess your language, make sure it's user-friendly, remove the jargon, and really clean it up in a way that people are going to engage with your post and engage with your paper. So those skills are really transferable to the communications community and what we do. So it's really good that the scientists that we interview also realize that, because they know the score. They've kind of got to that point in their career where they're giving these keynote lectures to a hall of 1,000 people from all of these various different backgrounds. So luckily, we've not really had any issues with people kind of not making their work accessible because, when we contact them, we say, okay, this is for the blog, this is for our online media section of the communications committee. This is the tone that we kind of want for these interviews. And it's really great that everybody's kind of on board and they know the score and they know the background and they know the kind of target audience. The main problem we have is people just being too busy. It's very often the case that we reach out to a scientist and they just don't reply, which is understandable because also they have their own lives. And when you do get to that point in your career, you're extremely busy. People might have like 20 students that they have to manage, and then they might do their own outreach and they might do, the various international talks and things. Yeah, I mean, it's understandable. It can be a little frustrating at times when people don't reply. But that's just the nature of it, really, because people are just busy.
And do you get any kind of insight into the impact the blog is having on regular people? Like, do you see things like traffic numbers, or do you have any kind of interaction with the community that reads the blog beyond the other scientists that are also interested in the conference?
I think our main source of feedback is probably comments on videos and on social media, really. As far as I'm aware, well, I don't at least have access to any sort of tracking numbers of clicks and things. So it is mainly kind of comments on videos and on social media. And what's really nice to see is that the main response is curiosity and that people just want to know more. So for example, in a year, I'd worked with a different kind of society within the OHBM community, student and postdoc special interest group. So also a bit of a mouthful of a name. Postdoc and student special interest group. I worked with them on a workshop describing kind of how to run certain modeling techniques, specifically dynamic causal modeling, which is something that I specialize in and have done since my PhD. And I think the top comment on that video is, can you make another one for fMRI? Because in my video, I focused on MEG and EEG, which are two neuroimaging techniques. And the top comment was, oh, can we have another one in a different imaging technique? Can we do this? What about this thing? So it's really nice to see that people are not only engaging, but kind of thinking about possibilities to do more in different formats and in different kind of, technical contexts. So yeah, it's really cool that, people are engaging in this way.
Yeah, there's a hunger for it, clearly. I was just thinking about the thought experiment we did at the beginning with the bag of colorful candy to describe the work that you do. How did you come up with that? Because that is a very good, it's a very effective science communication device. How did that story come up is my first question. And my follow-up question is, do you think that there are certain fields of brain mapping or neuroscience, I know those are both very broad, I'll let you pick how you want to answer it, that lend themselves better or worse to being something that the public can really easily engage with?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So first question about the thought experiment. This is going to sound really cliche, but I love a good TED Talk, and not just in the content of the TED Talks, but I think everybody who either gets invited or, stands on that stage and gives that lecture to the public, I don't know if they undergo training in public speaking, but they're all phenomenal public speakers, and the level and the content is always absolutely on point. And I've seen a few other lectures at various conferences where we kind of do this thought experiment exercise where you can kind of put yourself in the scenario where you're able to relate to kind of what's going on in the research and what people are interested in happening in the brain. So kind of a combination of those things. Basically, because, to be cliche once again, I've always wanted to give a TED Talk. It's kind of one of my bucket list things. So using those techniques from communicating with an audience and then also getting people to think about, so for example, if I described, if I hadn't used the bag of sweets analogy just gone. So we have this thing in the environment called unexpected uncertainty, and it's basically where we experience prediction error, where we're expecting to see prediction error, and I'll just talk data posterior. I've lost you. You've gone. You've walked out of the room. So even though it's the exact same concept that we do experience on a day-to-day basis, it's to kind of include your audience in the thing that you're talking about, I think is really important. And then your second question was about
whether there's certain fields or certain research themes or topics that might lend themselves better to, they're sexier for the public, you know what I mean? Or it's easier to maybe create that bridge of relatability for whatever reason.
Yeah. So I'm very lucky to work in human cognitive neuroscience because a lot of the concepts that I work on, people can relate to. So something that I've been particularly interested in is how these decision-making processes might go wrong in ADHD, for example. So then you can use this thought experiment to be like, okay, if you've experienced this kind of what I've heard from a lot of people who suffer from ADHD or ADHD-like experiences is when they need to do something in the house, the sink is full of dishes and they need to wash the dishes. And they're sat on the sofa and it's they have such desire and will to get up and do it, but they just can't. And something's stopping them from doing it, but they can't place what it is that's stopping them. And then you get really frustrated because you can't get up and do the thing. And then that's stopping you even more. And then you just enter this cycle and relate to that. So I'm really lucky in that I work on something that a lot of people can relate to. I recently attended a talk, like to kind of go to the flip side, that was talking about like a certain cell type in a certain type of fiber that contributes to pain processing. And like it was super, super cool. It was a really, really interesting talk. But because it's so on the micro scale, it's really hard to conceptualize what that looks like for somebody. So for example, this was a talk about pain, but it was very much about how our neurons on the kind of the cellular level and how compounds in our cells on the microscale level contribute to these processes that have this knock-on effect that eventually lead to chronic pain. So it's really hard, I think, in the molecular sciences to kind of translate that to real world experiences. And I've seen some people do it and they do an excellent job. I would find it really, really hard, to be like, okay, so we have this compound in the brain. It's like, you're going to relate to this eventually, but we have this tiny thing that you can't, even picture in your mind to then go from that to, and this is how it affects your life on a day-to-day basis. Like, I really, I bow down to those people who can kind of bring that to a lay audience, because it's hard.
I think I could be wrong with this, but I imagine it's two different kinds of audiences. I think most people, if you can make your science about them, like you did with the candy example and the dishes example, which made me feel so called out, it's not even funny. I think almost anyone can get on board with that and be like, yeah, that's cool, and then move on with their day. Whereas I think it takes a specific kind of person who's maybe already quite interested in science, for want of a better term, to sit out for that payoff of, this is where it starts, trust me, go on this journey with me, and then this is where it ends, and that's how it's related to you. Payoff, right? And actually, it reminds me of something that we might have even been, for the listeners, Ashley and I were in the same university doing overlapping degrees, so we had some shared classes. And I don't know if you were in this class, the neurotransmitters in action class.
Yes, I was.
Final year. Maybe you remember this, maybe not. This is the only thing I remember from that class. That there is, and it's the same kind of thing you were saying, that it was like a molecular level thing where one of the channel proteins in a neuron is printed wrong in one place because of one point mutation on a gene. And it means that a certain ion can't pass. And it means that the action potential doesn't work how it should. And it manifests in ataxia, which is basically like people can't really balance when they walk because there's a problem in their cerebellum. And that blew my freaking mind, because I was like, wow, so one little tiny, smallest possible piece of your DNA is just not the one it should be, and you can't balance. That's crazy. Like that, the fact that we could also draw that through line as humans, like, and as scientists is crazy. So yeah, I'm very clearly in the second camp of find those things cool, but not everybody maybe does. It's not as accessible as, oh, here's a bag of sweets and this is why you react in a certain way, or why certain people in certain groups react differently to others when they're confronted with a situation like this they don't expect. So
I remember a similar thing. I think it was a slightly different course, but it was in the same year, because I remember kind of those two lectures being like, wow, woo. And then you kind of just go home and you just sit and stare out and think like, existence is so fragile.
what was it?
It was, I think it was the genomes course, and we were talking about blood oranges. And like, I don't pay mind to fruits and vegetables, to be honest. It's kind of like something that I just go to the shop and I'm like, oh yeah, I'll get what my ingredients for whatever soup I want to make. But then I don't really think about like the process of how these things come to be, because it's just part of everyday life. But then in this lecture, we were talking about the genetics and the kind of exact set of environmental conditions that are necessary to produce a blood orange. And it was about how heat shock proteins in the plant have to reach a certain temperature, and then there's this activation, and then there's this other gene that contributes, and it's got to be a certain altitude and all these things. And then the stars have to align completely perfectly to produce the blood orange. And then I was like, so is the effort really worth it to make all of these blood orange flavored ciders and drinks and things? And because it's got to be everything's got to be absolutely perfect for this thing to be created. And yet we have it. And it's just like this Like, it kind of makes you think, what about all of the other things that didn't quite have that set of conditions that made it perfect to exist? You know, is there like, do we have secret fruits that we've just not unlocked yet?
That's really, really cool. I do want to just chat very briefly about advice for people close behind you in their career, couple of years behind, who might want to get involved in something like this and might be feeling feelings of uncertainty, ironically, or, you know, yeah. What do you have to say to people who might be considering getting involved in something like the ComCom that you're in and wanting to talk more about the work that they're doing and take on a bit more of a public-facing role than just academia? Did you get any kind of nerves about it when you first started, or did it feel very natural? And do you have any practical tips for them to how to get started?
I think I definitely had some nerves, for example, going into my first video interview, because even though kind of I had my list of questions that I knew that I wanted to ask, you can never predict how somebody is going to respond to that. And then often they're like this kind of really big name in the field. It's like, oh, I'm going to talk to such and such a person, and I'm really nervous because their work is so cool and I'm fangirling, you know. But I would say just take the leap of faith and get involved, because the biggest thing that I regret as part of this kind of science communication journey is that I didn't start earlier, because I either felt like I wouldn't have time to do it, or I felt like I wouldn't be very good at it, or I felt like I would be nervous speaking to these people. You know, at the end of the day, like, it's a learning curve that we continue on. Like, I'm still very much learning about the best ways to communicate and how to, not only how to manage kind of the communication side of things, but also how to manage the team that I've kind of now found myself in charge of some people that are also contributing to this process. Yeah, I think also it was very fortuitous for me to bump into my friend at the conference and then just get talking about this, and the ball just started to naturally roll itself. So I think just reaching out to people that you know that are involved in these things and speaking to people, because worst case scenario is that people don't respond. And at the end of the day, that's not a big deal if people don't respond, because people are busy. It's very rarely going to be anything personal that you just don't get responded to. It's just people have their own lives that they have to get on with. So kind of take the initiative and reach out to people. If you want to do it, just do it. Yeah, because particularly when I was a younger researcher, it was very easy for me to kind of just like get stuck in my head thinking, oh, but what if all of this goes wrong? And what if people don't like me? And what if I'm not very good? It's like, it doesn't matter, because we're all still learning and we're all just trying to do our best. So yeah, talk to people, use your connections, and just take that leap of faith, and just learn along the way.
I love that. That's such a good message, and I think it applies to everything that we try to do. Where can people get in touch with you if they want to ask you any questions or follow along your work?
So mainly Blue Sky and LinkedIn, but if people reach out via email, I will also try my best to respond to emails as well. Those are the three things that I check the most, essentially. Yeah, so I'm happy to answer any questions and talk about science and communication and both things.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Ashley. It's been a wonderful conversation and so nice to reconnect after so long. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
It's been really nice to chat.
Of course. And the work you're doing sounds super, super awesome, and I can't wait to see how it progresses.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
And that's a wrap on my conversation with Ashley Tyrer. Thank you so much for tuning in. Don't forget to leave a 5-star review, subscribe, leave a comment, share the love, and as always, I will see you next time.